Hello, welcome to WDH. If you're tired of AI generated slop and want the real human storytelling, please subscribe to support this channel. My name is Maria and I'll be your narrator. Let's get into the story now. The stagecoach stopped lay isolated a lonely cluster of the weatherwood and dusty earth in the vast expanse of the prairie. The wind whipped across the plain, carrying grit that stung her face and pricked at her exposed arm. She huddled beneath the slanted roof of the small waiting shed, one hand pressed against the swell of her belly, the other clutching the worn shawl she had wrapped around herself for warmth. The sun was low, burning gold crossed the horizon, but its light offered no comfort. Her husband was gone, vanished, without a word, without explanation, left behind at this desolate waypoint. She was pregnant, alone, and trembling with the realization that she had no one to depend on. Each sound around her wrecking wood, distant hoofbeats, the faint clatter of the stage coach in the distance seemed magnificent, echoing her fear and amplifying the hollow ache of abandonment. Her mind raced, replaying his last words, trying to make the sense of his sudden departure. How could he leave her like this? How could he abandon the child they were supposed to bring into the world together? Angled bubble beneath the surface, but it was swiftly buried beneath a deeper, more consuming emotion fear. She knew the word was mercilessness, and she was vulnerable. Every moment without the shelter, food, or a familiar hand felt like a gamble with her life and the life inside her. The stagecoach stopped. Was a place of fleeting safety for weary travelers now seemed a trap. The benches were empty, the lanterns until and the wind swept. Dirt whispered of isolation. She was alone with her thoughts and the oppressive silence, and that silence carried the weight of finality. The betrayal was not just in his living, it was in the utter lack of preparation. The casual disgrace of for her survival. She was forced to reckon not only with his absence, but with the immense responsibility that had been thrust upon her. The child growing inside her depended entirely on her. Yet, even in this desolation, flickers of determination emerged. She adjusted her shawl, drew a deep breath, and scanned the horizon. There would be no succor in the self pity, no magic in despair. Survival meant moving beyond the fear, confronting the unknown and finding the strength in the places she had never thought to look. Each small task, finding water, securing a spot out of the wind, conserving her energy, was an exercise in courage. And with each passing moment, the reality sank in. She could not wait for the salvation to arrive. She had to prepare herself. By the time the sky deepened into the bruised shades of purple and the crimson, she was a woman transformed, not yet tr- triumphant, but no longer merely a victim. And it closes with her poised to the edges of necessity and resolve, a figure both fragile and indomitable, waiting for the next encounter that might define her fate, the appearance of the epic warrior, whose help would come with conditions she could neither ignore nor fully trust. The wind shifting, carrying a strange sound, a soft crunch of boots on dirt, deliberate in my ears, she stiffened. She stiffened, pressing herself against the edge of the wooden shed, her heart hammering. At first, she hoped it was another traveler, a friendly hand, a chance for aid, but the figure that emerged from the dust was unlike anyone she had ever since. Cloaked and armored, a sword strapped to their back, the warrior moved with a quiet authority that seemed almost unnatural in the vast emptiness. Eyes narrowed beneath a hood, essence calculating every step was careful, deliberate, yet effortless, as though the wildness itself bent around them. The young woman's instinct was to retreat, to hide. She had survived abandonment. Once she couldn't survive it again.
But this presence was different. It was neither cruel nor comforting. It was neutral, a force whose intentions were unknown and whose power was undeniable. The warrior paused a few feet away, hands empty, voice calm yet firm. You should not be here alone. Help is possible, but it is not free. The word struck her like a blow. Help. After everything, after being left to fend for herself, yet the sharpness of his warning reminded her of the truth she had already sensed. Survival demanded alliances, even imperfect ones. Pride wrestled with necessity. Could she trust him? Could she accept assistance from someone whose compassion came with conditions, and yet the weight of her pregnancy, the cold that seeped into her bones, and the emptiness of the stagecoach stopped the pushed her towards the acquaintances. The warrior explained the term. Aid would be offered in exchange for a further for the future obligation, a debt that could not be ignored and died. It was generosity. It was a strategy, and yet the offer itself, as conditional as it was, it brought relief. She was not helpless, not yet. She would not survive on the pride alone. And this figure, this enigmatic stranger, could offer the resources, guidance, and the protection she could no longer provide for herself. But even as she noted, even as she accepted, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. This help was lifeline, yes, but it was a rope tied to roots she did not fully understand. As they set off together towards the pressed shelter of a nearby ridge, the woman's thoughts swelled with the mistrust, fear, and tentative hope. Each step alongside the warrior reinforced the imbalance of power. She was aware, painfully or so, of her vulnerability, and yet, for the first time since her husband's abandonment, she felt a fragile sense of possibility. Survival might not depend solely on her grit, it might also depend on navigating the intricacies of the conditional compassion of choosing carefully how and when to rely on another. Closes with the woman walking beside the warrior, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them. She is still alone in her affairs, still wary of this stranger's intention, but she is no longer entirely helpless. The journey ahead will test her resilience, her trust, and her ability to balance necessity with the self respect. The encounter has shifted her story from merry survival to a tense negotiation between vulnerability and agency, marking the beginning of delicate and uncertain partnership. The days that followed were relentless. The young woman quickly realized that accepting the warrior's help was only the beginning. Survival demanded constant vigilance, resilience, and a cunning she had never needed before. The stagecoach stop, once a symbol of abandonment, had become a reference point in the landscape that offered little mercy. The wind carried more than dust. It brought the scent of predators, the sting of a relentless sun, and the sharp tang of fear that seems to clinch to every moment. The warrior kept a steady pace, silent and observant, offering guidance only when necessary. He taught her to read the land, which plants were edible, which water was safe to drink, and where the earth might conceal danger. Yet the help was always yet never generous. Every aid came with a reminder that her survival was conditional, that her indebtedness was real, and that the world did not forgive weakness. Each lesson was a test, each act of assistance a subtle measure of her willpower and ability to endure. Pregnancy compounded the challenge. Her body betrayed her at the moments of weakness, exhaustion setting in faster than she expected. She stumbled, struggled to keep pace, and wrestled with nausea and pain that no instruction could alleviate. Every step was a negotiation, discover a latent strength, undulating, a deep undulating, un- a deep, unyielding determination that refused to be subdued. The child growing within her became a quiet anchor, a source of stubborn purpose that gave her a reason to endure even when despair threatened to overwhelm. The wilderness itself seemed almost antagonistic. Sudden storms swept across the plain, torrential rain turning dirt paths into the slick mud, forcing them to find shelter under jagged cliffs or in the hollowed out rock formation. Wild animals sprawled the edges of the sparse forest, reminding her that vulnerability invited danger, and yet in these harsh conditions, she learned to move carefully, to conserve the energy, and to observe the rhythm of the land. The warrior's lessons were harsh but invaluable. Survival was as much about the strategy and foresight and as it was about the physical endurance. Emotionally, she returned. Emotionally, she teetered between the gratitude and resentment. The warriors and the warrior's conditional compassion was a lifeline, but it was a reminder that help alone could not undo the suffering of abandonment. Every act of assistance was tempered by distance and caution, reinforcing the bitter truth that she could not rely on anyone else to shield her from the hardship. Her mind became a battlefield of conflicting emotions, hope intervened with the fear, pride struggling against necessity, and trust wearing with instinctual suspicion. By the end of this, she had transformed. She was no longer the fragile, abandoned woman left at the stagecoach stop. She had become a survivor in her own rights, capable of negotiating, capable of navigating the wildness, enduring the pain, and making the choices under pressure. Her partnership with the warrior remained uneasy, a balance of necessity and the caution, yet in the crucible of the struggle, she had discovered her inner resilience, and the faint, steady pulse of hope began to emerge, a hope that she could not endure but shape her own identity. The finest stretch of her journey was both the hardest and the most defining. Months of exposure to the wind, sun, and his isolation had etched strength into her body and steel into her spirit. The landscape around her had become intimate. Each bend in the path, each hidden water source, each grove of the sheltering trees she had memorized. Yet the changes did not relent. The wilderness remained indifferent to her survival, indifferent to her courage. Every step was still a negotiation with danger, every breath a reminder that life hung by a fragile thread. The epic warrior, whose conditional compassion had been a lifeline, remained a shadow beside her, neither entirely trusted nor fully rejected. Their interaction were marked by a silent understanding and subtle power dynamics. She depended on him, but she no longer depended wholly. Every instruction, every mere act of help reinforced the delicate balance of autonomy and reliance. She had learned to read his gesture, to anticipate his moves, and to assert herself when necessary. Conditional compassion had taught her a harsh truth. Help could sustain life, but it could not shield the heart from struggle or erase the consequences of betrayal. Her pregnancy has progressed, and with it, a new dimension of vulnerability and courage. Each laborious step, each shiver of fatigue reminded her that she was not alone in fight. The child inside her was a living symbol of hope, but also a constant reminder that survival was not simply for herself anymore. Every risk she took, every strategy she devised was for both of them. She had become a planner, a strategist, and a protector. Forces for all roles posted upon her by abandonment, yet embraced through necessity and emerging strength. The warrior's presence, once an enigma of power and conditional mercy, became a mirror for her own transformation. Where she had once trembled in fear at his authority, she now walked beside him with eyes unflinching, mirroring, assessing. There was respect in their silence, an unspoken acknowledgement of her resilience. Yet, the end of this chapter offered no tidy resolution. The help he provided could not undo the pain she had endured, the betrayal she had felt, or the isolation she had survived. Compassion, conditional though it was, had limits. She realized that true survival, the kind that shaped identity and fogged willpower, was hers alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with bruised oranges and purple, she stood at the edge of a bluff overlooking a valley below, the wind tangling her hair around her face. The stagecoach stopped. The barren, the barren roads and the months of the struggle felt simultaneously distant and immediate. He had endured. He had survived, and yet a quiet tension lingered in her chest, a reminder that some burdens could never be fully lifted. The warrior's figure reset slightly, leaving her to contemplate the journey she had navigated alone, even with his aid. Closing on the ambiguity and the quiet she had not been rescued. She had carved the survival from despair. Conditional compassion had offered a threat, but it was her own resilience, courage, and tenacity that had carried her through. The horizon stretch ahead, vast, unknown, and filled with possibility. She would face it not as an abandoned woman left at the stagecoach stop, but as a survivor who understood painfully and intimately that strength is forged in struggle. Endurance is learned in solitude, and some victories are defined not by who help us, but what you have endured yourself.